Go to record. Let's do that. Oh. There we go. Okay. As I've just said, if anybody has any questions as I go along and they're kind of relevant to what I'm talking about at the time, please feel free to ping it onto the chat, and it pops up so I can see it, and then I'll pick it up or save it till the end if it's something I'm going to cover. So welcome to tonight's CPD. I don't know, I'm based in Gloucester and the weather is absolutely horrible today. It's mad that I did the other one 2 weeks ago and it was that lush weather, and it's really drizzly and horrible tonight. Today I'm going to be talking about assessment, Key Stage 3 assessment, essentially going through the system that we're now at in my department. The last session that I did was much more about the kind of journey of making lots of changes and implementing those changes, but it's not so much about the journey tonight. It's just more specifically about the systems that we've put in place, the use of knowledge organisers, because there were a lot of questions on that last time, and I know people do use them, so hopefully I won't be repeating too much what you already know. So I've tried to kind of answer some of the questions in more detail that were given last time, and then I'll talk about the assessment system. So, as I said, I'll get going now. The three things that I'm going to be talking about, so I've used another metaphor because I just love metaphors. So last time it was the mountain, this time I'm talking about machinery. The first thing I'm going to talk about, as I said, is knowledge organisers, how they are kind of a central, a pivotal kind of cog in a really good assessment system. But obviously there's so much more than that, so I'll talk more about that when I talk about them. We're talking about the systems that we put in place, so how we kind of centralise things, and the reasons behind those decisions. And then finally, what I'll look at is, well, what I'll show you is examples of students' work, so you'll see it in practice. And some of the examples I've got is a student who's about to go into year 10, and I've got work back from them in year 7 through 7, 8 and 9. So you'll see what that journey looks like for a student in terms of, and the feedback we give. So I said last time for the session that it wasn't going to be too research based, and it's the same today. I mean, it's not that I don't enjoy research or read it. It's just that it's much more for me about just sharing some practical stuff. But I'll just start with a couple of things to signpost that a lot of what we did is based on. Someone's just asked if there was a recording available for the first session, and yes, I think it's on my pinned tweet. I think I put it on YouTube, so it's on there. It will always be on there, it won't be taken off. So the first book, Making Good Progress, I read this a few years ago, whenever it came out, I think, before I was in any role of responsibility. And I remember honestly reading it and thinking, oh my God, I'm a horrendous teacher and there's so much, I'm doing everything wrong, in a good way. And when I moved into the role in charge of Key Stage 3, pretty much most of what I did in terms of assessment was based on this book. It is amazing. It's probably one of the best education books I've ever read. And I'm not going to signpost any more. I'm just going to reference a blog in a second. But honestly, read it if you want to kind of think about assessment. The second one is from Joe Facer. I read that one last summer. And the reason I've put that on there is because if you're looking at introducing knowledge organisers, that is the best book, I think, for a summary of them and how they're used. It's very concise. But if it's something you're looking at, that's probably the best way to go. It's a great kind of version of how to introduce knowledge organisers. And I saw Joe Facer speak at Research Ed maybe like 5-6 years ago, and that was where she talked about knowledge and briefly about knowledge organisers, and that's kind of where that journey started. Skipped twice then, I'm just going to go back. This is an excellent blog, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about is based on this kind of analogy, so I just want to draw your attention to it. If you haven't got a copy of Making Good Progress, this is an amazing blog where essentially Chris Lulu argues that assessment is like a marathon, and a marathon runner won't run a marathon every week or every lesson. And so assessment shouldn't be constantly doing the same thing over and over again, writing an essay. That's not how it works. It needs to be more broken down than that. And the way I look at it in the department and the way we talk about it is it's about compartmentalizing skills. So for example, we do a formative assessment on just writing points, and we'll get students to write 10 points just so they know how to open a paragraph. And that's what we'll give feedback on. She explains it in more detail in the blog and then in more detail in the book. So that, I just thought it was worth signposting a couple of things before I get into the specifics. So we'll talk first then about knowledge organisers. So these are some of the things that I'm going to cover. As I said, they were things that were asked last time. So how we designed them, how they're implemented, what the expectation is for students and then teachers, and then how we try and make sure that they are long term. And what I mean by that is that students don't stick them in the back of their book and forget about them. So I'll hopefully talk about that. So in terms of the design of knowledge organisers, we initially met as a department and we collaborated on creating them together. I think that was really important. I mentioned that in the last session. I don't want to repeat too much what I've said, but I'm aware some different people might be here, so hopefully I won't. And we kind of came up with a format that we wanted to use, and then people sat down and worked on different ones themselves, and then we went away and typed them up. Now, there are two reasons for this. So essentially, we decided that we wanted, I say we, it was me and my head of department, although it was initially introduced in Key Stage 3, and I was definitely pushing it. So we wanted the same design or structure of the knowledge organiser for every single one. Now that's not to do with being slightly anal about how things look, or to do with kind of being controlling. It's more for the students. It's more for the sense that they go from one term to the next and they know what they're looking at and they know how to use it. And we were really clear about the design of them. And this is mentioned in Joe Facer's book. And I think quite a lot of people have introduced knowledge organisers, and I've seen some online, and I mean, I've taken some from online, so this isn't a kind of a rude comment to anyone, but I've seen some online where they're, an A3 page or back to back, and it's just too much for the students. The point of a knowledge organiser is that you're saying to a student, I need you to learn everything on here. And if you write things in paragraphs or in prose, they're going to struggle to learn it unless you want them to be repeating whole paragraphs, which I don't really think is the point. So we said that for every single knowledge organiser from Key Stage 3 all the way up to Key Stage 5, they would only be one side of A4. Every single one has to have 2 columns within a section where you have the item, the thing, maybe it's a term or maybe it's a word or whatever that you want students to learn, and then the definition of it. And that definition should be as succinct as possible. Students should be able to memorize both sides. It's not just about recalling words, it's also about defining them and then obviously being able to apply them. And I think, again, this is up for debate, so I don't believe in making them massively colourful, mainly because of just cognitive overload, but also photocopying costs, because you're printing 250. I know that's not the reason to do things, but it is part of it. And I say no images. We've recently added like symbols for the quotations, because that's the symbols that students use we use in 5 a day and students use on their flashcards. But that's kind of the most. They shouldn't have kind of, elaborate images and sketches on them unless it's an art knowledge organiser, but I'm talking about English, I guess. Sorry, someone's asked a question. The thing here is that the design of them, it had to be something that wasn't going to overload students. And genuinely, our theory is that by the end of that term, they can recall the whole thing. And I'll show you examples later on of students being tested on the whole knowledge organiser at the end of a term. So I'm talking 3 times a year. Somebody said about consulting with other departments and a whole school approach. So that's a good question. When we introduced it in English 2 towards the end, towards 3 years ago, they weren't being used across the school. They're now being used across the school, but that's being led by the teaching and learning assistant head, and that started this year. And there were guidelines similar to that, but there wasn't a uniform approach across the school. It was, though, one side of A4 per topic or whatever, and 2 columns and all that sort of stuff, because we helped out with some of the CPD with it, and we talked about what we'd done in English. So I really feel, I know this sounds like really over the top, but I really feel quite strongly about how they look. So I'm going to show an example now. As I said, I did show an example last week. I don't know if this is one of the ones I showed last week, but hopefully it's clear. So this is the first year 8. So this is term 1, year 8. This is a unit. It was originally on travel writing. It's now on the Gothic, but that's a side point. This unit is, they were learning, they were using extracts from travel texts, and then they were writing travel journey texts up until Christmas. The thing is about knowledge organisers, it's the stuff that you need them to take all the way through. Okay, so as you can see, the words on here are not a list of the texts that they're reading, because the texts are a vehicle for us to deliver the knowledge, and also for them to apply the skills. That isn't necessarily something you want them to retain for 5 years. Anything on these knowledge organisers are things that we expect them to know in year 11, because we're saying this is the knowledge we're committing to, and we expect you to know all of this when you arrive in to begin your GCSEs in year 10. So as you can see, it's split into sections. We begin here with Freytag's pyramid, and that's because that's one of the earliest things we deliver in that unit. So they're designed so that the teacher will deliver these elements of knowledge gradually, and then the students will be self-quizzing them week on week sort of thing. They're part of the homework system. I'll talk about that in a second, but they're also designed, as I mentioned at the start, so that students can cover half one side up and quiz themselves. And that's really important. I've seen a lot of knowledge organisers where the line in the middle is all skew with. They're not going to be able to actually self-quiz or look, cover, write, check, which I would say is the most preferred method from students. I mean, some do make flashcards and some create quizzes from them and stuff, but I would say the most common method, if you asked all the students in Key Stage 3, is look, cover, write, check, because they're familiar with it, because they do it with spellings often in year 7, year 6 in primary school and lower down. So they might be able to cover, it needs to be so that they can cover the terms and then write them down, or the definitions. And then we have the ambitious vocabulary at the side, which is a little bit annoying because it's on one single column, but we expect them to cover it and pull it down. I know these are really minor technical things, but hopefully people will find them useful. Okay, so how are they implemented? So the reason I've used this kind of like cog and machinery metaphor is because I strongly feel that a really good assessment system works, has lots of like various components, and everything's got to be spinning for the whole system to work, for us to be producing assessments which are reliable and valid, to be getting data which is comparable and measurable, and to be helping students make progress. Like, everything has to be working, everything has to be within a system. And the reason the knowledge organisers are a cog is because they are part of everything. And arguably, your curriculum is almost like another machine that works alongside the assessment, and knowledge organisers are part of your curriculum as well. So I said this last time, the reason we place the knowledge organisers in the curriculum booklets for students, and I think that's one of the ways they were so successful, because they were not a sheet that got stuck in and then forgotten where it was. So if you're expecting students to refer to it on a lesson to lesson basis, if you're expecting students to use it every week for homework, if it just gets stuck in a book somewhere, they're not going to find it. So I would suggest, if you don't use booklets, maybe put in a tab in so that they can easily go back to it, because they need to see this document as highly valuable, and we need to show them it's that, but they also need to be able to have access to it. Our students take their books home and their booklets home, so they always have them with them, which is a kind of a practical thing. But also, I think I said last week, like the booklets are a really big deal, and if they lose them, they have to pay to replace them. So they don't want to lose them, and therefore they know their knowledge organizer is important. It's slightly different at Key Stage 4, and different teachers do it different ways. But in terms of Key Stage 3, that's how we do it. So our homework system, again, I mentioned this in the last session, so do go back and watch it because I explained it in more detail. I'm not going to repeat it all here, but the homework system is entirely dependent on knowledge organisers and the self-quizzing of knowledge organisers. And a lot of that came from Rebecca Foster's blog about self-quizzing. And I visited her school, 2 years ago, and saw that in action, maybe more than 2 years ago, actually. And when we decided to implement the knowledge organisers, I was like, this is how we make them important, is because it's our whole homework system at Key Stage 3 pivots on this. We use them for drill questions, so the 5 a day at the start of every lesson. Now, this is actually quite an important part of it, because before we had the knowledge organisers, we introduced the drill questions, or at least sent out a blog about it, suggested to people they might want to do it. A few of us were doing it, not everybody was. It wasn't like a department expectation. It was just like testing things out. And the problem is, when you don't have that like core agreed knowledge, drill questions can just feel like another thing for a teacher to add on to a lesson, or it can just make people think, oh, that's something else I'm expected to do. When you've got the sheet in front of you and all previous knowledge organisers, you're able to go, right, what questions am I going to ask today? Okay, we did Freytag last week, so I'm going to do a question on that. I'll do something from the end of year 7. And that's another thing about them, is that the drill questions can be kind of short-term and long-term knowledge, because we've got these centralised knowledge organisers. So I know that I can test, I've got a year 9 group next year, I know that I can refer to any of the year 8 knowledge organisers, and they should have been taught and retained that knowledge. But obviously, when you don't have that core agreed knowledge in place, then there's no way really to ensure that, you know, a class has been taught something that you want them to know a year ago. Or you can't be sat there thinking, oh, well, I taught my class that last year, so why don't they know it? You've got the agreed kind of sheets of knowledge. They're part of both the formative and summative assessment systems, which I'm going to come on to in more detail in a second. And obviously there's the expectation. This is probably the least concrete or tangible of that list of things, because obviously you can see all those other things happening. You can see students doing drill questions in their books. You can see the homework, because we use quizzes on Show My Homework, so you can see that taking place. But the teachers referring to them is obviously less tangible, although it is something that I'm pretty confident does happen quite consistently from being around the department. More so after a couple of years of using them. Okay, the expectation on students is actually really simple. Obviously, they keep them safe and they keep them in their books, but the main thing that they do at Key Stage 3 is to self-quiz weekly on the different sections. What we found now is that we get students coming in year 10 who know how to properly revise in terms of like knowledge, not so much skills. That's still something that needs developing. But we definitely get students arriving who remember content from a long time ago, and are able to be given a knowledge organizer on poetry and go away and revise it. We don't have to reteach it. Expectation on teachers. So this is quite important, I think, the first one, and something that I think is often overlooked. No matter how great you think your class are, you have to constantly remind them how to use them. So it's not uncommon for me to, like, even halfway through the year when they've already done loads of homework, self-quizzing, to just get the knowledge organizer under the visualizer and just remind them, this is how we cover it up. Can I test myself? Oh, I got one wrong. Let me check. Look, cover right, check. Oh, I'm going to make some quick flashcards. They don't have to be fancy. It's just a piece of paper with one on either side. Lovely. So I've put often in brackets because I think students need reminding of a lot of things. Yes, their knowledge, because retrieval practice, as we all know, but also how to do things. And also what I do quite like is finishing a term and then saying to students, just asking a few students how they've self-quizzed, because often they come up with weird and wonderful ways, which are still retrieval practice, and getting other students to kind of pick up different strategies as well. We originally did really good daily and I would say weekly recap. Then last year we read, the school gave everyone a copy of Sherrington's Rose and Shine's Principles of Instruction. And that was when all the other departments were creating their knowledge organisers. But obviously we were at a lucky stage where we had them, and we'd been using them for a year or two. I can't remember, it's all a blur. So we looked at how we could refine our use, and one of the ways we came up with was making sure we were doing monthly reviews as well as daily and weekly. And that's something that still needs refining, I think, but I'll show some examples of that when I show the books. Someone's just asked a question, good question, how do we check their self-quizzing? Well, here's the thing. You can, some schools use self-quizzing books. We decided against that in the end because we just felt, because they already have an assessment book and a class workbook, we felt another book might be too much. At Key Stage 4 we do have assessment quizzing books, like the spelling books, and we give those out, or we check those. In Key Stage 3 they quiz on a section at home, and then they do a quiz on show my homework, but obviously because they're doing it at home, they could have the knowledge organiser in front of them. We're not stupid. We don't look at it and think, oh, they got 100%, amazing. That's more to check that they're doing it. And it's a way to sanction. So if they don't do the quiz on show my homework, it's very unlikely they've done any quizzing. So then they'll get a follow-up detention. But in terms of checking whether they've done it, that's done through formative knowledge organiser tests, which I'll come on to in a bit, which we do. So I would say the 5 a day is like low stakes quizzing, and then the knowledge organiser review points, which are a form of our formative assessments in our assessment system, are the main way we would check. And if a student drastically underperformed, so it wouldn't be like, oh, it's out of 20 and Bob in the corner got 3 out of 20, so I'm going to shame him in front of the whole class, tell him off, say he hasn't been doing his homework, and keep him in at lunchtime. That's not what it's like, but it's much more like a quiet conversation with Bob where I say to Bob, that's not a great school. I would like to look at your self-quizzing next week because I just want to make sure you're doing it right. So we might target certain students to check their self-quizzing if we feel like their knowledge scores are quite low, but we don't check everyone's weekly. Someone said something about Google Forms. We use quizzes on Show My Homework. They're all preloaded for the whole year, weekly ones. So we use those, although we are trialing Microsoft Teams at the moment. So I don't know whether we'll move to the Microsoft Forms. And somebody's mentioned the 5 a day. I think is it coming up? So in terms of the 5 a day, what I think, so I've put here to informally track success. It's really important with like retrieval practice style things that you don't over egg it and you don't make it really high stakes, because often that can cause a problem. So what we do instead is now with the way what things are going to happen when we return to school, I don't know if this will happen, but the expectation would be circulating the room and seeing how many students have got, or sometimes I might do like hands up if you've got 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, just as a quick check to check the success rate. If it's really low, you're probably going to have to revisit things, but not make it like, apart from if we're doing it as a formative assessment, some teachers might record the scores, but for 5 a day, we don't get them all to call out their scores every lesson, partly because it would take too long. But it's obviously good practice for the teacher to have a look. And I will always go round, and if 5 students haven't answered question number 1, then I need to go over that like straight away once we go through the answers. Because I would say on average students will be scoring 4 out of 5 normally. But obviously some of it is old knowledge as well that you haven't delivered. Okay, someone's just asked a question about differentiating, which I think I'm going to talk about, but I don't know if I do, so I'll just finish this one and then I'll answer that question. Teacher expectation to make explicit links to the knowledge organiser and to link to past knowledge organisers. So an example of that is when we were doing Of Mice and Men in year 9, we got to the end of the book and I was like, oh, So they're back in the brush, they're back from, they're back in the same location where they started. It's just mentioned the heron and the snake, and the weather's changed slightly and they can hear noises. So what is Steinbeck doing here? Why return to this place? And I kind of was trying to push at the whole cyclical narrative thing, but I thought a student would say something about going back to the location. And one student put their hand up and was like, oh, it's a cyclical narrative like we did last year. And I was like, yes, it is. And that's not a student I taught last year. And that's on the year 8 term 1 knowledge organizer. So they've obviously retained that knowledge for a year, and then they can apply it to the next thing, to something new. This is an interesting one. I think it's really, and people do this, to raise concerns about the knowledge that you're offering students, to say, I don't know if they need to know that, or I don't think that explanation, that definition is quite right, or I think that this isn't quite relevant to this unit. Like, that's really important to have an open conversation. The Key Stage 4 ones, I know this is about Key Stage 3, but the Key Stage 4 knowledge organisers I've adapted like so many times. So they used to just have a list of quotations. Now I've put the quotations in chronological order because I felt that was better to break them up along as you were teaching the text. I've added in who says them because that was confusing students. We've now added in the symbols. So I think it's important to have an open dialogue. Like, it should not be, it's the same as curriculum. It should not be a finished piece of paper. This is the knowledge we will teach forever, because these things have to be kind of adapted and reviewed. And also, what I think is really interesting about the knowledge organisers is they really have helped teachers to develop their subject knowledge. So there might be things on there that teachers wouldn't typically have taught, and this is where I'll talk about the differentiation. So the answer essentially to your question is no, they're not differentiated. Is that every class does the same knowledge organiser. And there are lots of reasons for that. The main reason is that I feel that a knowledge-rich curriculum is part of addressing social injustice and encouraging and developing things like cultural capital, and just helping students learn more, right? And I feel that when I first started being in charge of Key Stage 3, I think I mentioned this in the other session, I wrote terminology lists, and that each term they had 10 words that they had to teach, teachers had to teach, which was not enough, obviously. And I differentiated them, and it kind of made me uncomfortable within 6 months, because I had a bottom set and I was only teaching them the top 5 words, but a student who had been placed on, probably based on Key Stage 2 data, 2 sets above, was learning 5 extra words. Like, why would I not teach them all those words? Sure, they might not take it away in as much detail, or sure, when they have to actually apply the knowledge in terms of skills, they might not do it in the same way, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be provided the same playing field as everyone else, the same knowledge. And I introduced them at Key Stage 4 with a group that was set 9 of 10. And last year, or this year, this current GCSE year that's just gone through, I taught set 1 and set 9. They had the same knowledge organisers throughout. They were both able to retain the knowledge. They were both able to recall the knowledge. It's what they do with it, obviously, that differs. That's what makes them get different grades, ultimately. But I personally am quite against saying, right, this class, you're going to learn this knowledge organiser with all these fancy words, and this class, here's one for you with some less fancy words, because I think that's what you'll understand. I'm just not about that. So you could go into my classroom in my top set, or my set 1 or my set 9, and they could both be using avaricious for Scrooge, and they knew what it meant. Now, whether the students in the one class would be writing kind of an essay that presented a conceptual argument, probably not, but they knew the same amount of quotations as the other set. The other set might have picked up their own as we went along, but my minimum expectation was the same for both classes, and that comes from the knowledge organiser. And I'm personally, I don't feel, it doesn't sit right with me to give different ones to different classes. And in terms of what you said about reading skills, it's all in the delivery. So it's all in how the knowledge organisers are part of the curriculum, right? They supplement the curriculum and they get students revising it and recalling it and retrieving it at home, but the teacher will deliver that differently. They will deliver that information differently. They might spend a different amount of time on, we use Freytag's pyramid as an example. They're probably going to spend longer on it with a lower set, but that doesn't mean that they don't deserve to know it. or that they can't retrieve it. And yes, the average scores of assessments might be lower in the lower groups, but not dramatically. So we work out averages after each summative assessment. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And the average maybe out of 10 will start at 9, and then it might go down to like 7 or 6 out of 10. But that's still quite a lot of knowledge that those students are retaining, and they're still more than capable of doing that. And you might have a student in set 5 getting 10 out of 10 because they find it easy to retrieve, and they go away and they learn it. And you might have students in a higher set only getting 3 out of 10. So I think that's probably answered the question. I don't know if it's the right answer, but that's how I feel. Okay, so the final thing on knowledge organisers is how do they become long-term? And the main way of this is through the design of assessments, which I'm going to talk about assessment design in a second, through the teacher's delivery, through them being familiar, and that obviously becomes easier now that we've gone through the years of using them and we're more familiar with the terms on them, and then also relentless retrieval practice. You know, drill questions, questioning in lessons, going back to things. Okay, so I'm now going to talk about the actual assessment system. So what we centralised, why we centralised it, and the things that we put in place and why. So I'll cover what's in the assessments, how they're delivered, how we mark it, and then what happens when they get feedback. So hopefully that'll cover most things, but again, ask any questions as we go along. So what is in our assessments? I don't really know where I got this format from. I thought Freya, I think you're here listening, I thought I'd read a blog by, I think I did because I looked for it the other day, about having multiple choice questions before an extended task. I think I found the blog. In my head, I read it from something that you'd said, might have been on Twitter. So we have section A with core knowledge taken from previous knowledge organisers. We have section B, core knowledge taken from current knowledge organiser, that should be singular. And then section C is the extended assessment, which focuses on the specific skill that was developed in that unit. So it's not trying to get them, yes, Freya said yes, I thought so. And then, so the extended assessment is more about them practicing the skill. And obviously when you practice a skill, you're probably applying knowledge as well. So, in terms of, that's our summative assessment. I'm not going to go into all the stuff behind formative and summative assessments. I'm sure we're all aware of that. But the formative assessment is entirely teacher discretion. So we don't actually tell teachers how to deliver their formative assessments. I think that's quite important for me. I think the teachers should have the freedom to be able to think, right, I want to check that they know how to do this particular skill, so I'm going to get them to do a quick paragraph, or I'm going to get them to do a series of, like I said earlier, points on a topic. So the formative is entirely teacher discretion. I'll talk about the marking of it though in a second, but the summatives are always the same. Now we deliver them. This is probably the most contentious or controversial thing I'm going to talk about, is the delivery of Key Stage 3 assessments. So assessments are entirely blind. So they are not, the teachers do not know what's going to be in them, and the students do not know what's going to be in them. They know what skills are going to be assessed, and they obviously have the knowledge organisers that they've been learning, so they know it's going to come from them, but they don't know what questions are coming, particularly for the extended assessment. We do them in exam conditions. They complete the assessments in silence, and there is no help from the teachers. And they only have two lessons technically. They have one lesson to complete section A and B, and then they're peer marked, teacher checks, takes in the data, all that happens in one lesson. And then section C is one lesson, that's it. I'm going to briefly explain my reasoning behind this, and again, a lot of this comes from making good progress. You have two teachers, right, okay, and both of them love their job, and both of them care about their students, as we all do, because we don't turn up to work to cause problems. So you've got one teacher, and say they're both delivering a unit, the Of Mice and Men unit, okay? And teacher A decides before they start teaching of mice and men that they're going to do a question on Curly's wife. That's what they're going to do. That's what their assessment will be. They then deliver of mice and men with an absolute focus on Curly's wife, because even if it's subconsciously, even if they're not doing it consciously, they know that that's what they're going to assess their students on. And they care about their students and they want them to do well. So when Curly's wife enters, they spend a lesson or two on the opening extract. When there's an extract about George and Lenny, maybe they don't spend as long on it because they know that Curly's wife is coming up in the assessment. Get to the end of the book, I'll tell them what the assessment is and we'll do a bit of practice. We'll do a bit of modelling. I'll show them how to write a paragraph on this particular quotation from Curly's wife because that's going to help them. Wonderful. The students sit down, they do the assessment, the teacher helps them, and then the teacher marks it and say it's out of 50, and all the students get 40 out of 50. Lovely. We then have teacher B, who also equally loves their job and equally loves their students, who decides at the start of the unit that they are going to write their assessment at the end. And they deliver of mice and men, and they deliver it equally, and they cover all aspects like we do at GCSE because we don't know what the assessment's going to be. They teach the text in full without any focus on one particular thing. They get to the end of delivering. They then teach students how to respond to a question. How do they respond to an extract question? They show them different extracts. They show them different models. They then, on the morning of their assessment, decide, I'm going to do Curly's wife. Print it, students sit down, do it in silence. Maybe class B, students get 20 out of 50. I, as Key Stage 3 lead, take in that data, I look at that data and I think, oh my God, class B have bombed on this assessment. But the two sets of data are not comparable. They don't really measure what those students have achieved, because the students in class A probably have gained something. Of course, they've learnt something, but they've probably done a little bit of what we did in the controlled assessment days, which is a bit of regurgitating stuff that they've heard the teacher say. And that's all good and well, but that's not really a summative assessment. That's not really a measure of where they are. If you're going to do an assessment, a summative assessment, and you're going to take in data from it, you have to be able to see the different data as comparable. You have to be able to do some analysis of that data. And if it isn't valid and it isn't reliable, what's the point? There's no point. And I know that a lot of people might not agree with this, but I fundamentally feel that it's probably one of the most transformative things we've done in the department. We do it in Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5 as well. And students don't go into their English GCSE not knowing what it feels like to sit down and be faced with a question. Of course, there is value and there is merit in showing them example questions and working their way through it. But if they do that as their final summative assessment, then it's not really going to give you anything useful. And also, you're going to be providing feedback on something that they haven't really done by themselves. So the assessments are written by either myself or the secondary department. If, for example, he teaches year 8 and I don't, I might write the year 8 one just to make that more fair. I don't think that teachers cheat on assessments. I say cheat, but tell students the question or tell them what knowledge to remember because they are trying to boost their own scores. I just think it's because we care, but we're doing students a disservice, I think, if we design assessments in that way. So by this, I'm always talking about the summative assessments. Now, I use summative quite loosely because, as I'm sure we all know, the only real summative assessment that students do is their GCSE or their A-level, because a summative assessment is an endpoint, isn't it? And you're not meant to get feedback from it. And obviously, we still give feedback. But those are the conditions. And that's pretty much consistent across the department now. And I don't regret that. How did you make sure staff are confident, informed? Someone said, do we change our assessments each year? Yes. So we'll change the quizzes and we'll change the assessments. Sometimes we don't, hit and miss. depends how we're feeling, how busy we are, because we now have a bank of assessments we've built up. And we also provide teachers, I should probably say this as well, because maybe I sound like I'm trying to catch people out, and I'm really, really not. Teachers get a mock. I don't want to call it a mock because they're not like full exams, but an example assessment for each unit. So they know the format of it, and they've got an example questions, series of questions, extract or whatever. So it's not about like catching teachers out. It's just about getting something really reliable and ensuring students know what that feels like. I can't, I'll read that one after. So the marking of the assessment, I probably should have said as well, we use an assessment calendar. So all the assessments are calendarized. Teachers know when they are. This prevents like that build up of assessment where you do like 10 assessments at the end of a half term and then you end up marking them over half term. We spread them out across the term. Students do 3 summative assessments per year. So normally 1 per term. And because they're calendarized, teachers know when they're coming, etc., and they can plan for them. So in terms of marking, the most important thing that I would want to see on a piece of students' work is some form of target code. We have them, we centralize them across the department, but teachers have the flexibility to write their own target if the ones that we've provided don't fit, obviously. But that's the main thing that I would want to see. Now this is in terms of summative. They might choose to annotate the students' work, they might choose to circle errors, they might choose to offer comments. That's their choice. And they might choose to highlight. We had a highlighting code in the school, which is essentially yellow for good stuff, pink for stuff that needs improving. Some teachers still use that, and that's fine. It's not a whole school thing anymore, but lots of departments do use it, and students know what it means. Somebody asked in the last session, do we not expect them to circle literacy errors? And I thought about this a lot this week. I would say most times, if I look in books, teachers do that. I think we all do that naturally anyway. But if I was doing like an assessment, a paragraph, just looking at method analysis, and the student doesn't use a capital letter at the start, I'll probably circle it. But if they're not using capital letters a lot, I wouldn't overdo the looking at that literacy error element, because I think what it can do potentially is it can distract from what we're really wanting the student to focus on, which is the skill of analysis. And this kind of goes back to what Daisy Christodoulou says about the marathon running, about we need to compartmentalize these skills. We need to really focus on different things. When we train for a marathon, I don't run marathons, but when we train for a marathon, we don't run a marathon every day. And if we're not asking students to do a full exam where their literacy might be marked, then do we need to overmark the literacy? What happens then when you give feedback is a student will sit there and go through and change their capital letters, but the actual thing you need them to do is to identify a language device and comment on it. And that's really what you're looking at. What you're looking at is developing that one skill. And sometimes the other noise can take a student away from that. So obviously it's good practice to circle errors, but if I looked in a book where a student was being tested on some other skill and the teacher hadn't circled it, I wouldn't be concerned. And I definitely wouldn't be having a conversation about it, because I'm sure there would be a reason. Okay, what happens when students get their feedback? So we began with teachers filling these out. Unmanageable workload. I know that sounds mental because we do 3 assessments a year, and I know a lot of departments do a lot more than that. But it was, not only was it unmanageable workload, it was just pointless. Like, it didn't add anything to the students' feedback. So they complete their own feedback slip where they copy in their target and they fill in the knowledge that they got wrong. I'll show you examples of it in a second. We had centralised dirt lessons, so they're sent out. So because the assessments are centralised and because everybody does the same assessment at the same time, it's easy to provide a centralised dirt lesson. We didn't do this originally, but what we would find is some teachers would deliver dirt, like, here's your target code, write it down, okay, let's get back to the book or whatever. And other teachers might spend 2-3 lessons getting the students to redraft it and rewrite it. Neither of those is necessarily the right way to do it. Who knows what the right way is to do anything in teaching, but at least we wanted all students to get the same kind of level of feedback and the same time to improve. Students in that feedback, they review their own incorrect knowledge, so we go through the correct answers, make sure they write them down. Students use the target code that's been given, and then they're given a specific activity and they have to refine an element of that skill that they've been assessed on. Again, I'll show examples of this in a minute. In terms of formative, so that's like once a term, 3 times a year, and one of those is the whole school exam. So really it's twice in lessons in our curriculum time. The formative is done in various ways. So I keep saying I'm gonna show some examples in a second, which I will. Some might, if it's like a knowledge test, they might be peer marked, they might be self-marked. Self-marked is obviously preferable for retrieval practice, but if it's kind of a big one, you might get them to switch it over. And I would say the main type of feedback we give is whole class feedback for formative assessments. I picked a load of books from the department, not from my own class, because I thought, it's easy to show, here's how I do the marking, but I wanted to show other students. So I've picked a load of books, and you'll see in a second various versions, but when I picked them up and I went through them, it was, we do like open book looks where I say to everyone, bring some books, and it's mainly like a sharing good practice. It's not me looking at people's books. And when we do those and we look through it, pretty much most of us use whole class feedback, I would say. Here we go. There's quite a few questions. I'm going to have to come back to those because there's quite a few. I'm sorry. I will definitely come back to them though. Promise. I'm nearly done anyway. It's just examples now. So the process for students. So this is my final big piece of machinery from the outside. I just thought it looked like a good picture. I think it's some sort of oil rig. I don't even know. Not a engineer. But it's got cogs, so it works. So this section is literally just me showing you examples of work and just explaining them. So I'm going to do that and then I'm finished and I'll answer the questions. So this is a typical cycle for a year 7 student. So I would say they get, someone asked me this last week and I just can't put a number on it. And our whole school assessment policy has pretty much removed any, which has been written by the old head of English. And it's very similar to what we do in English. It's been rewritten and it doesn't refer to how often students should be marked. It says that all the centralised assessments should be deep marked, in other words, with like target codes or individual kind of targets, but that all the rest of it is department based. So this is a cycle for a year 7 student. So it says October, but that's because we set them around then. So this student would have not long been set. So this would be the first piece of work that they do with their teacher. Easy, little knowledge review quiz. Maybe they've gone away, they've done that for their homework and the teacher's just got them to fill it in. They've assumed they marked their own, I can't really tell. They've marked it. Maybe the teacher's taken in the score, but that is a form of formative assessment. That is one of those like training things that builds to that marathon. And I think there's a real trick being missed here with English teachers, that we think that an assessment is like a paragraph or like an essay. This is assessment. This is a style of formative assessment. The student knows exactly where they've gone wrong and they'll improve next time. It still works as assessment. This is then their second formative assessment, which is a longer section of the knowledge organiser where they've been tested on 2 other bits. It might build up. I tend to add the previous section in as well to check whether they've learnt more, but there's an example. And then this is an example of another formative assessment. So you're seeing a whole cycle throughout a whole term here. So in this case, the teachers obviously taught them analytical paragraphs. We use a structure PNU, which we designed as a department, which we use in year 7 and 8 and some 9. And then the idea is that they know that structure by the time they get to GCSE and we can adapt it and level it up. But anyway, so I know people are against acronyms, so I thought it was worth mentioning that. So the teacher's given a nice little comment and a sticker. They don't have to do that, but it is nice. Students do like that sort of thing. And then they've just got a target code. By the way, the student highlighted that. That's not the teacher. I think the teachers put the little nice Zoom bit at the side, but they haven't highlighted the whole thing. And then we've got a whole class feedback sheet. So the teacher might read through all the work. They might choose to correct some things, circle some things, maybe leave a comment. But the main thing is they'll leave a target code. Or in some cases, teachers might not leave a target code, and then maybe they've taken 2 targets away and they want all students to work on them. So there's an example of the whole class feedback sheet. I'm sure people have seen examples of this. We use the ones from the Positive Teacher Company. I'm getting ones made this year specific to our department, because we're putting a couple of we're adapting it a little bit and making it landscape, because clearly I like things to look right and I don't like them being stuck on the side. So irrelevant, sorry. So examples of good work, so literally writing down examples of what students have written, spellings, etc. And then, I forgot to mention, it's going to let me go back. And then the student has then done some work on the specific target they've been given. So that would be like a typical formative cycle. This is now a summative. This is actually the exam. So it's slightly different to what I said earlier, which is not that helpful. But in the case of the exams that are held in the hall, because we get more time, it's a slightly different. So they'll do the terminology test or knowledge test first. They'll then do a slightly kind of broken down questions to do with an extract that links to their first term, because they're not most assessments. I don't know why that's down there. Most assessments are done in the spring term. Yeah. So we might do something that links to autumn, and then something that they're currently working on, which for some reason it hasn't popped up. The student's written the whole page. I don't know why it's done that. It's probably me just moving things around, where they've just written about a poem that they've studied, actually, in fact, in that case. And then this is their dirt. So they've got the feedback sheet that the student has then filled in. They're meant to write their targets in here, but for some reason she's written them out in her book, but whatever. So you can see she got one word wrong on the knowledge test, so she's just written down the word. She got 4 out of 4 there, so that's fine. And then she's got her target codes, which she's then worked through in the different colour pen. We don't tell them what colour to use, they just have to use a different colour. This is, and this is the last one. Now, this is a student who is now about to go into year 10. So this is examples of work back from the end of year 7. So this is actually when my work from my class, that didn't make sense, my marking. So this is a student who, this is from the end of year 7. So I trialed the knowledge organiser, and this is, 2 years. This is an example. So you've got different section knowledge organiser, which then builds up to, by the end of term, so this is running alongside the skills that we're teaching, they'll do a whole knowledge organiser test. She's done all right in that. I think most of it's right, looking quite good. So just cutting out half of it, like that was how I trialled it in year 7, but now we might cut out different sides. But yeah, you can see that there. This is year 7 assessment. So this is the kind of 20 questions. She's got 20 out of 20 there, lovely. And then we've got an extract with a few kind of information retrieval, make some suggestions, analyse, just basic skills really. That is a formative assessment in year 8. So again, you can see very similar marking, bit of pink and yellow, few things corrected, target code at the end, whole class feedback, dirt. So you can see that cycle again. This is the year 8 exam. So there we go. The sheet looks slightly different here because we kind of adapted them each year. But again, they write it in, they write the target code, and that on the right hand side is their dirt. So they've literally rewritten their answer because they weren't happy. They got a couple of targets and they thought, right, I'm going to go and do it again. And we're now into year 9. So this is another different teacher. Still, again, the student knows what's coming. They know how to use whole class feedback because we're using it across the department. So a paragraph with some success criteria, whole class feedback. Oh, I haven't put the dirt on that one, sorry. But this I really like. This is the 19th of December. So this was a centralised assessment. And if you look here, this is in year 9, and she's got section A as year 7 and 8 knowledge. And so she would have had knowledge organisers in year 8 and 1 at the end of year 7. And what we've got here, she's got 10 out of 10. And if you look at the questions, they're very mixed. So this isn't easy. Wilfred Owen's mentor, part of Freytag's pyramid, definition of a tragic hero, what happens in a Shakespearean comedy, a word, one of the off the vocabulary list in year 7, I think. Poem, contextual questions. If you look at that, and then she's got 10 out of 10, which I think says something about the use of knowledge organisers, about that centralised system. And then there's an example of the assessment that follows that. So it becomes more loosely based on GCSEs by the time they get to year 9, but not overly. So in that example, you can see there's a true or false, but I think true or false is a good question style anyway. It's not because AQA do it on paper 2, it's because it's a good way to get them making inferences and stuff. And that's it. That's me done. So hopefully I've covered lots of the questions that people asked last week. I could probably speak about assessment for a lot longer than I have. I've done it for an hour though, and when I tried this the other day, I did about 40 minutes, and I thought, oh god, that's quite short. But obviously I've done some extra waffling and answered questions. So I'll go to the questions now. People saying thank you, you're more than welcome. I'm going to go to the ones that I missed earlier, and I'll answer them. If you don't have a question, feel free to leave though. Thank you so much for sharing this evening with me. But if you do have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer any. I hope it was useful. But if you have any further questions that you don't want to ask on the chat, feel free to ping them on Twitter. I'm more than happy to answer them on there as well. So I answered the do you change your assessments each year. Something we're trying to prevent, and we'll follow this method in September. I think that might be regarding the all teachers doing their own thing. Yeah. I kind of get why some departments prefer it, but I just don't think it's valid. Like, I just don't, I don't know, I'm quite against it, so I won't go anymore. I think I explained it why earlier, but moved all key stage 3 assessments being unseen extracts from a different text. That's interesting. So for example, our mice and men scheme ends with an unseen extract on it. That's a good way to do it, isn't it? Because then they really are having to apply what they've learned from the one text to another. Quite like that. Do you find 3 assessment points per year is enough to track progress? That's a good question. Yes. But I think so much of it comes down to trust. Like, I think how many report points, I think we only have 3 anyway. But I fundamentally trust the teachers to be able to identify the progress of their students, because by only doing 3 summative assessments, when I first started, we did 1.5 term, and the formative assessment just wasn't happening. So like teachers would plow on for 6 weeks to do a summative thing, and then they'd be like to the students, oh, to get better at that skill, you need to do this, but now we're going to move on to writing anyway, so you can't apply that. And I think by stripping back the assessments, we've given teachers more time to formatively assess and to address misconceptions and to address how to develop student skills, because they've got more time to do the things that they want to target. And then the summative assessments are just so much more powerful and so much more measurable. I think some schools do less. I think it's more than enough. Yeah. Can you give any examples of the code you've centralised in your department that you would expect to see on their work? I've got ones for Key Stage 4, and Key Stage 3 are a lot shorter. I think I shared one in the session last week on the dirt slide. I'll go through the questions and then I'll just try and find one. Like I said, I'm not on the right computer, so I might not be able to. Whoever that is who's asked that question, I'll try and post something on Twitter later of an example, because otherwise I'm probably going to spend 5 minutes trying to find a relevant document. So just make a note of that. But yeah, they're different for each assessment. But like I did say this last week, assessment target codes. I said this last week, like, we often, when you do an assessment with students, so many of them make the same mistake. So you tend to kind of know what's coming, even like on a whole year group level. And obviously we know what's coming and we try and address it, but that doesn't always mean that we fix that thing. Maybe they're going to do it in the assessment anyway. So yeah, I'll share some of that later if that's okay, whoever said that on Twitter. Other noise, not overdoing marking. Yeah. I just think it's noise. And I think it's really hard for students to even properly respond to any kind of feedback. But when you're trying to like tell them all the stuff to do, I believe that one target code, one thing they need to work on, they sit and do it, you tell them how to do it, that's enough. Much more can just be too much for them. A grade, no, we don't. We use, well, the school uses flight paths and we have flight paths. So at the end of an assessment, at the end of a summative assessment, a student will just be told if their work is indicative of their flight path. Sometimes we use on, above, below. In the exams, which are one time a year, they do get a percentage in that because it's marked like out of 4 or out of 2 or out of 6 or whatever. But in the other assessments, there's no marks to it. I've worked in, well, we've trialed different systems where we don't give them anything, where we don't give them any grade, any mark, and there are benefits to that. And I've also worked in systems where you give them like a grade every time, and obviously that's also dangerous because then they just look at the grade and they don't bother doing the feedback. So we don't give a different grade on their work, but when they get their reports, they get an indication of where they are on their flight path. And that's part of formative and summative assessment. Good question. And if you give a grade, how do you generate this? Do you have a marking rubric? So that's, I don't think I mentioned that. So for each assessment, as well as the centralised DIRT, we provide a mark scheme. So every single assessment that we've written at Key Stage 3 has a mark scheme with it that then tells teachers what the student would be doing to be indicative of each flight path or to get a certain mark, etc. As I said, the whole school exams are out of 40, and I think students quite like that, having that kind of measurable number. We take in the marks out of 10 for their knowledge tests, and then so we have that as some sort of indication, but we take in just whether they're above, on, or below with the extended writing, but we still have a mark scheme for each one. I don't know if that answers that question. Let me know if not. I didn't realise I didn't say that. Formative and summative assessments are done in assessment books, yes. So I think I might have said this in the other one and then thought I'd said it now. So they have their lesson books, which we don't mark. No marking, no tick and flick. Teachers will obviously look at it in the classroom, they'll give live feedback, but then they have an assessment book where all the formative and summatives go. And they stay in school. Would you be able to share your target quotes? Someone else said that. Yeah, I can share the Key Stage 4 ones. I've got ones for everything with DIRT tasks, but I don't think I shared them because I think a lot of people were making them at the same time, because I think Chris Curtis shared his examples and then people took those away and adapted them. But I've got one for everything, so I'll share them for Key Stage 4. And then Key Stage 3, I'm happy to share them, but they're different for each assessment, so they're tailored to the assessment, but happy to share them. That's a few thank yous. All more than welcome. I don't know if Freya's still here, who said you are amazing, but you are amazing too. You are all amazing. Team English is amazing. A very important question. The font again. Someone mentioned that at the start. Delicious Adventures from dafont.com. Oh God, I think I'm just going to be known as a font woman for the rest of my life. I love it. What headings do you have on your whole class feedback sheet? So the new one that we've adapted, that I've ordered them from the oh my God, the Positive Teacher Company, which is great, by the way, like best planners. I don't know what I'm like plugging it. I don't own shares or anything, but best planners, best diaries, best praise sheets. They do whole class feedback marking books, which are really reasonable price, and they also do tear off pads, which are only like a £5. So a couple of years back, the head of department bought one for everyone in the department a few years back. So I've now had them adapted this year because we've got new staff who don't have one, and the headings are, there's a really big box for things to work on, to put like the targets in and explain what we want them to do. We've got star performers, so kind of a shout out to a student who's done really well. Good examples, where you write down actual kind of phrasing from the students. Spelling errors, top tips, which I've added in, and misconceptions. So the misconceptions is more like general things, and then the top tips are that what I found is that teachers were using their own kind of mini target code. So for example, I might go for a piece of work, and every time a student starts a sentence with "this quotation means" or whatever, or "I know this because," and doesn't embed the quotation, I might put a big star, and then it means that on the feedback grid I can just put star, avoid clunky introductions to your quotations, make sure you embed them like this. So that's how it's been developed. They're being made at the moment, and when they arrive and when I use them, when we go back and everything's back to normal, I'll share one. I shared one on Twitter last year because I literally marked like 50 year 11 books in like an hour using whole class feedback, and I shared it on Twitter and it went mad. So I don't know, I thought whole class feedback was like a kind of used across the board, but perhaps not. Okay, thanks, you're welcome. Yes, Jane, sharing the PowerPoint, not just the session, 100% can do that. That's not a problem at all. I'll share it on one of the various sites that I use. That's not a problem. Yeah. Or could I send it? I don't know if I can add PowerPoints on Eventbrite. I'll get it available. That's absolutely fine. Yes. Do you assess reading and writing in each summative assessment? No, we do not. Across each year, I would say there are 2 reading, 1 writing. And the reading one, it tends to be like fiction and non-fiction, and then a writing assessment. So we assess their writing once a year, but obviously it's not the only time it's assessed. It will be assessed a lot. We also do writing challenges, the Chris Curtis ones. We do it as an in-house competition. So each term or month, depending on who's running it, because a different person takes it on each year. I think last year it was each term they'll do a writing challenge lesson, which is kind of like a free writing thing, and then the teacher nominates like a winner, and then we do a whole key stage winner and a year group winner, and they win like a book and certificate, and they love it. Try and do competitions in-house because it means that we know someone's going to win, rather than sending it off and never hearing back. But we do less writing, but we encourage the writing in other ways. We have various writing clubs that I think still build those writing skills, but we don't over assess it. Someone said thank you. I think that was the person about the target code. Someone else asked about swapping reading to writing. So yeah, 2 reading, 1 writing, I would say. So somebody said, do you give marks on the longer writing tasks or just the target? How does that feed into the reporting data sent to parents? Thank you for sharing your time. You're more than welcome regarding the time. And then I will say, I think I sort of said this earlier, but maybe not as clear. So essentially they get the target code unless it's the full year exam where they get marks. So they can then work that out as a percentage. In terms of reporting data sent to parents, that's done by the teachers. The teachers decide if they're on, above or below where they should be, and that's what the parents get. And then obviously parents' evenings, we often take assessment books to parents' evening to show the parents their work, because we have that separate book system. It's a lot easier to do that because we keep the assessment books in school, but that's kind of what feeds into it. And so the teacher will report on a department level whether the student's on, above or below. And then when we call them ISMs, but when parent reports come round, I or the Key Stage 3 lead, the second in department, will do a check and just check that it tallies up with all their assessments. But that's the only way. And if a student had consistently performed below and their knowledge scores were really low and the teacher had said they were above flight path, maybe that would need a conversation about how they arrived at that. Maybe all their formative assessments are actually quite strong and they just struggle with the summative. I don't know, but that's how we would do it. I'm not sure if that answers the question, so let me know if not. Do you report knowledge tests? No, yeah, we give them the full mark out of 10. They know that, and that's on every single one. They have to call it out as well because we record it on a spreadsheet, but they're pretty used to it now. Makes a big deal out of it. Super helpful. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, you're more than welcome. Someone's asked about sharing examples of mark schemes. Yeah, they're specific to the assessments, but yeah, that's fine. Not a problem with that. People saying thank you, you're more than welcome. Lots of thank yous. I think that might be the end of the questions. Oh. It's always about the fonts. I think I'm at the bottom. There we go. Right, there's 22 of you left, so hopefully I've answered all your questions. Oh, yes. Oh, I thought, Yasmin, I thought you said next week's session then, and I was thinking, I'm not doing another one, but you said last week, so enjoy that. It's still available. I was thinking, oh, what have I done something that I think this is it for me now on the CPD front. Like, I feel like major imposter syndrome by doing things like this. So I'm just trying to, like, I think that it's been amazing, all the CPD that's been on offer, and I feel like if people I feel like by offering up my time, then I can watch someone else, if that makes sense. It's like pay it forward, isn't it? Random chat or about Key Stage 3, I'm keen. Just message me and we can arrange something. That's not a problem at all. Right. Okay, I think that's it. How many people are left? 19. You're all welcome. Have a lovely night. I'm guessing people are going now, but like, any questions, let me know, but I'll probably turn it off in a second. You're more than welcome, Zoe. Right, I'm going to head off now. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording.